Let's talk.
Giles Brown.
Perfect storm. Russia's failed economic opening, the hurricane of war and sanctions, and the uncertain future hardcover is the story of Russia's opening to the West between 1992 and 2022, where it succeeded and where it failed. My next guest has written the book Perfect Storm. He's a professor of political science at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. I'm delighted that Thane Gustafson joins us live on the line now. Thane, good morning to you.
Good morning, Giles. Thanks very much for the invitation.
Pleasure's all mine. Whereabouts are you sitting today, sir? Where do we find you?
I'm in Washington, D.C. I'm a professor at Georgetown University in Washington and have traveled all over Russia these past 30 years as a consultant, as a professor. My focus has been very much on Russia, and so this book really captures that 30-year experience.
And it's a fascinating period because 1992, so we've had the downfall of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev has gone. Yeltsin has come into place. We don't really know that much, but basically we in the West think this is going to be marvelous. Russia's going to open up to Western markets. There'll be a McDonald's or a fast food place on every corner, and Russia is about to embrace democracy. As considerably younger people then, both yourself and myself, well, at least I, was perhaps a little bit excited about the opening up of Russia?
I think there was tremendous enthusiasm, Giles. Russians poured out of Russia into places all over Europe in particular, but also Israel, the United States, Brooklyn, New York, and so on. London came to be known as Londongrad. And there were Russians of all kinds, ordinary people trying to protect their savings. There was also the mafia. There was also Gazprom, the Russian gas giant. Westerners poured into Russia, and in particular, investors for big companies, Renault in particular. That was quite a story. BP as well. And at the same time, thousands and thousands of smaller businesses, many of which might have been I don't want to say Russian fronts, that makes it seem kind of dark, but just Russians opening businesses and moving goods into Russia under a Western brand name.
And of course, the thing is, as younger men at the end of, say, 1985 through to 1992, when you see, because we grew up, we were used to the Cold War. We didn't think in our lifetimes the Berlin Wall would come down. We didn't think that the Warsaw Pact would break up so spectacularly. And then it came in a tide of wonderful, in most cases, mainly bloodless revolutions. And then Russia fell as well. And were we perhaps naive to think that having been under a feudal yoke, a Tsarist yoke, and then a Soviet yoke for centuries, that Russia would suddenly spin itself around and become this sort of huggy-feely, touchy, happy-clappy democracy literally within a week?
Well, yes, I think there was a good deal of naivete on both sides, but certainly high hopes. But behind that, I think, was a fundamental misunderstanding on both sides. For the West, it was Western pressure, it was the Cold War, it was the pressure of military spending that had caused the Soviet Union to collapse. So our take on it was, we've won. The Russian take on it was, we destroyed ourselves. The Soviet Union fell apart because of its own weaknesses, inefficiencies, et cetera. So when the Westerners poured into Russia with their story of Western victory, it was the story of globalization at its high point, but also of we won, move over. The Russians resented tremendously. They thought it was the wrong narrative with the wrong implications.
Because you underestimate the Russian psyche at your peril, don't you? I mean, the one thing, I mean, being based in Spain, we have had an awful lot of Russians, and having been based in London, we have had an awful lot of Russians come down here, and they are an intensely proud people. They're intensely patriotic people. They love a dasher in the countryside and to commune with nature, shall we say? But again, because Russia, Peter the Great notwithstanding, Russia has. It's difficult to say that Russia is kind of European, and they still have that pride, which was obviously sort of turbocharged during the Soviet Union time. And then when the Soviet Union goes almost overnight, they are left bereft. They question everything they know, and there is a vacuum.
Well, that's right. And I'm glad you raised that point, because there is a great deal of talk under Putin that Russia is pivoting to the east, that Russia is building with China what Xi Jinping and Putin describe as a no-limits friendship. The Russians are, at the moment, seeing a lot of Chinese products pouring into Russia. And the big question is that pivot to the east a fundamental shift in what has, as you say, quite rightly, has been historically a European focus. But look at the map. The western part of Russia has most of the population, and it's the part that borders on Europe, for better and for worse, as we can talk about when we get to Ukraine. But the remaining 80% beyond the Urals is the vast expanse of Russia, 11 time zones, stretching all the way to the Pacific. But that's not been the center of Russian civilization by any means. And when Russians send their kids to foreign schools, they don't send them to Beijing, they send them to Switzerland. When they open a business outside Russia, it's not in Shanghai. It's in London, and so on. So Russia is still a European story.
But the thing is, because there has been, back in the day, should we say, at the height of the Cold War in the 60s and the 70s, you've got the People's Republic of China, you've got the Soviet Union. They may be communist/socialist states, but they do not see eye to eye. Mao and Brezhnev are certainly not sort of cozying up. They may be supporting proxies in Vietnam or in Laos and whatever, but just because you're a communist doesn't mean you're going to get on, fantastically well with your neighbor. And there is that whole eastern, you've got Vladivostok, you've got that looking towards Japan. I mean, that whole sort of what we would call Southeast Asia stroke, that whole sphere of influence is maybe and they view each other sort of rather warily, Thane.
Well, that's right. It was a bumpy relationship from the beginning, with a lot of mistrust on both sides, a lot of resentment by the Chinese as the Russians poured in and basically said, move over, we'll show you how to do it. So I guess when two civilizations come into contact, there's a bit of that. But let's come back to Spain, Giles. The Spain was not a major player in this rush into Russia. The French, the Germans, the Americans were the lead companies. Spain entered into an interesting relationship with Russia in those days by taking Russian gas. And you'll say, well, wait a minute, Spain's a long way from Russia. How could you bring gas? Well, it was LNG, which was an industry being born. And so Spain is one of the countries taking Russian LNG, and I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe they still are, even though that's become now very controversial, and the European Union is considering banning all that. But that was Spain's relationship to this whole adventure.
And also, of course, because it's a very welcoming country here in Spain. And if you're Europe, there was what we called the golden visa was going on. So if you bought a property over $500,000, you were allowed to live here permanently. And if you're the head of a company, making mineral water somewhere west of the Urals, and you're there with Svetlana, her, your lovely wife, and she's seeing the Gucci, and you're suddenly going to think, well, hang on, we can move out of here. And also so that was very appealing to them. And also, of course, it is
Marbella. The name Marbella comes to mind,
which is where I'm sitting at the moment. So therefore,
oh well, there you are in the world.
So yeah, as I said before,
when you walk out of your office down the street, you'll probably run into a fair number of Russians of all kinds. Some of the leading oligarchs have properties there.
Yes, but the interesting thing with the Russians, and again it goes back to the psyche, they are an intensely private people. When the Russians move somewhere, you don't see a great number of Russian bars opening up or nightclubs. They prefer to have their parties behind their gated complexes, or they'll go to somewhere in the countryside and let loose there. And I've got a couple of stories which I may tell you later. But basically, it was found to be very welcoming. However, these are people at the top end of the scale.
That's broadly true.
Yeah.
And part of that is for security reasons, but it depends on where you are. For example, the Russian community in Cyprus. First of all, they're so numerous that they can't avoid bumping into each other. But you have all kinds of, shall we say, communities within communities. One of the more entertaining one is the community of divorced Russian wives who have been parked in Cyprus by their ex-husbands.
Yeah.
They
Yes.
form a whole micro-society unto themselves.
Please tell me there's a membership badge saying to that one. I can see like wearing a badge of the divorced Russian wives Cypriot branch.
That's right. But Leningrad, there are some neighborhoods of London where you hear more Russian than English, and so on.
The thing is, though, of course, this was people welcome the money, but we didn't. And again, people always go where the money is, and there was always sort of this tongue in cheek about banditi, who were right, and there was this sort of, the mafioso, and it was seen as a stereotype, a guy in what you call a wife beater t-shirt, and that Boris or something. But actually, when people were doing business in Russia, the Western investors who like to think they were a little bit edgy would say, oh, it's like the Wild West. But actually, it kind of was, and that turned back to bite them, Thane.
Well, the Wild West sometimes was called the Wild East, and Westerners who came in encountered a very different civilization. It was wild for the specific reason that the Soviet system had fallen apart. And the thing that held the Soviet Union together was the Communist Party apparatus, which reached into every office, every home, controlled the media, controlled the economy. And that abruptly disappeared. And it left, as you said, Giles, a vacuum. It was free for all. And the doctrines of privatization and globalization added on to that. And all of a sudden, Russia was for sale. But wait a minute, not for sale to Westerners, thank you, but sales to Russians themselves who were smart enough and fast enough and well-connected enough to be able to seize the properties that were basically like low-hanging fruit.
In those early days, though, I mean, how much, because Yeltsin was in power, and how you look back at that now and you think, was that a man unsuited to the role that he took over? And so, because he became almost a figure of fun towards the end of his premiership, he was a Russian of the old school and perhaps not as adept in the dark arts that would become apparent with his successor.
Well, that's right. And I think in retrospect, Yeltsin appears as a kind of a parenthesis. The real adventure, shall we say, the real future of Russia starts to take shape in the form of a totally surprising man, unexpected man, who comes out of shall we say, the other side of the tracks in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, who through various stages in his adolescence starts to learn German, of all things. the accidental man, so to speak, the advice of his teacher who says, Vladimir, learn German. He applies to the KGB and ultimately is accepted, and he's posted in Germany. So there he is, a man who has tremendous exposure, but to East Germany, of course. Their Germany, not ours. But we don't know very much about his assignment for the KGB in those days, but presumably he was in charge of a whole network that was very active in Germany. So there he is, the school of life, but the KGB falls apart in those days, and suddenly he's without a job. So one story that Putin himself tells is that he took his wife and kids, packed them into a German-made Trabant. He roped the family washing machine on top of the Trabant and drove all the way back to St. Petersburg. So talk about humble origins. But he parlays that into a position in the St. Petersburg government, becomes responsible for Western investment in dealing with Westerners. Westerners liked him. He was very businesslike and honest, got things done, and came to the attention of the Yeltsin government. So he moved to Moscow, and the rest is history.
Indeed. I mean, he's a self-made man. He's a street fighter. Let's not, he has come from the wrong side of the tracks. He's in East Germany. That means the Stasi are around as well. The most highly surveilled. I mean, people complain about being under Big Brother now, but if you were in East Germany, in the post-war period up until, you were being, and the amount of stuff that the Stasi shredded, and the files that they kept, I mean, he would have picked up a lot of hints from there. When he gets, and again, for a Russian to learn German, we again, it's this, I always go back to the psyche, because people go, oh yeah, the Russians and Germans, but there is it's like Russians and Poles. There is a huge thing built into the DNA of that system, Great Patriotic War, etc., and the barbarity and the suffering that the Russian people went under.
Well, that's exactly right. It's a special relationship, has been throughout Russian history, with its ups and downs, a love-hate affair in so many ways. The Russians admire the Germans. One saying in Russia, goes back over the decades, is if you see a machine, you can be sure that there's a German nearby. So that's very much the kind of relationship that it is. Putin made a tremendous impression when he stood in front of the German parliament, the Bundestag, and gave a speech in German. Now, he had a written text in front of him, which he would consult from time to time, but what really struck the deputies was that most of it was ad lib and in very decent German. Angela Merkel, Germany's premier in those years, had actually been raised in East Germany and had, on summer vacations, participated in summer programs in Moscow. She had won prizes for her command of the Russian language. So here you have Merkel and Putin face to face. She has fluent Russian, he has fluent German, and they couldn't stand one another's accents.
But this is all great if you're talking major powers, but it soon becomes apparent that there may be a sort of entente cordiale going on between Russia and Germany. But if you are a former Soviet republic, if you are Georgia, if you are Chechnya, and ultimately if you are Ukraine, there isn't, Putin is not going to be open to talk with you, and the dark side comes down very heavily on those people. When you consider the people, Georgia's Shevardnadze and Stalin, for goodness sake, and yet they feel the full force, and obviously the repercussions of what happens in Chechnya can still be felt, and then we come through to Ukraine.
Well, you're right to go there, Giles, and that, I think, one of the definitions of tragedy is when something happens that is inevitable. And I think conflict was inevitable. You have On the one hand, the European Union, which is becoming stronger and is also reaching out to the East, to the new Europe that is now becoming open for membership. The membership of the EU nearly doubles with new members. But you can also visualize how this appears to the Russians as their entire sphere of influence is dissolving before their very eyes. And instead, what they're facing is a whole phalanx of newly independent countries that are resentful toward Russia and are moving to consolidate their membership in the European Union. Now, in the middle of all of that is Ukraine, and Ukraine is a weird beast, you might say, because it's half Russian in the east, it's half Ukrainian/European in the west. The west comes out of roots in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It's absolutely not Russian in its history. And then those two Ukraines sort of meet in the middle in Kiev. I used to live in Kiev as an exchange student way back when. I may even have been the only American in Kiev in those years, early 70s. But I can tell you it was very much a Russian-speaking town. It was a Soviet, shall we say, provincial backwater, a secondary capital. And the idea that it would become a focus for civil war and invasion by Russia and contest between Europe and Russia, that seemed unimaginable at the time. Now, for Washington, this was a tremendous dilemma. We faced a choice. We Americans faced a choice. Do we place our bets on the new Europe, which historically, of course, has been our ally, or do we place our bets on this new, seemingly democratic, wide open Russia? Well, we placed our bets on Europe. And in retrospect, it was the right bet. But that also meant that we were on the European side in this increasingly fractious relationship, and with Ukraine in the middle.
And as this sort of relationship or this pans out, we get the invasion, we get sanctions, and if you have Putin can tap into a deep-seated paranoia against the West, which goes all the way back to, he's born in Leningrad, St. Petersburg, goes back to St. Peter. St. Peter gets, chases Charles of Sweden's army all the way down to Ukraine in the whatever century. And it's very easy for him to say, as Russia fails as an open market, so the average man in Moscow hasn't seen, okay, he might be able to get Levi's, but everybody else has gone on to live in Marbella, and he's thinking, the system is broken, this isn't what I wanted. And Putin can go, well, you see, that is the problem, that the West is absolutely against us. We must stand, as we've stood before as the Soviet Union, against the West, because they don't really like us. And that gives him, carte blanche to crack down on everybody and everything, as we've seen happen, and it leaves us in the situation where we are now. Is that roughly an okay thing to say, Thane, do you think?
Well, that's right. And I think you're right to focus on Putin. In addition to everything that we've talked about, this is very much a Putin story because of the background that we've already talked about. I think Putin has felt increasingly angry. He started out, I think, being fairly open to what was going on. He was the most European of Russian rulers since Catherine the Great, who, as it happens, was a German princess. So, so this very German Russian gradually, I think, turns hostile. Again, I think this is very much Putin's background as a proud Russian and as a former Soviet KGB person and so on. It all fits together and produces this reaction of growing rage on Putin's part. He tried very hard to control Ukraine. He traveled there frequently. There was one year in which he made half a dozen trips and each time that a new ruler of Ukraine would come along, he would attempt to form a relationship with that person and draw that person into the Russian fold as part of their version of the common market,
like Belarus has done, for example.
Well, indeed, absolutely. And each time it failed. Each time a new Ukrainian president came along, that president escaped his grasp and turned to Europe instead. And this mounting anger and frustration over repeated failure to draw Ukraine into the Russian orbit, I think goes a long way to explaining why Putin feels that he can control Ukraine, that he must control Ukraine, and that the enemy in this battle is not only Europe, but especially the United States.
And yet, the invasion is launched, and we were all sitting there thinking, well, that's Ukraine gone. 72 hours later, we're going to see tanks thundering down the main street. But that doesn't happen. And that must have been, if Putin was enraged before then, he must have gone thermonuclear at that point, because unfortunately the Russian military machine or the Russian society in general, or the corruption has come back to bite them. And so all those tanks without fuel, all those incompetent generals are something, they underestimate. It's the logistics which gets them. They run out of fuel. The weaponry isn't functioning. And again, and we're still going on with this, he gets more insular, but also more frustrated. We have the whole Wagner situation. I mean, it's, are we seeing, and I know the book only deals with this particular period of this 30 years, but while Biden's in charge, he must have an absolute, and I choose my word carefully here, siege mentality, if not bunker mentality, because he seems beset by incompetence, which, pretty much comes to pass, Thane.
Well, I guess the question is who's besieging whom. From the Russian perspective, this eastward movement of the European Union is putting Russia under siege. From the Western perspective, of course, it's the pushback, the invasion that's putting Europe under siege. So far, no resolution of those two, how would you say, narratives of resentment and betrayal. Now, I'm not excusing in the least the behavior of Putin and the Russians in his entourage. They are guilty of war crimes. They're guilty of unspeakable horrors. This is Putin's doing, and it will be his legacy. Now, this leads to the question that I raised in my book, Perfect Storm, with Oxford Press. It's just out. And the question is, could there be another reopening of Russia to the West, despite everything that's happened? And I think that it is not entirely impossible, given the European orientation of Russia and the background that so many Russians have developed in the West over those years. But there's a famous saying from a Greek philosopher who said, "No man enters the same river twice. It's not the same river, and it's not the same man."
Yeah.
You're going to build a hopeful scenario out of all of this mess. Then first, there are two conditions that are required. One of them is Putin has to be gone. So we're talking about a long-range scenario here into the 2030s. He's in good health, apparently. So this is a long-range scenario. And the other is there has to be some kind of more or less stable resolution of the Ukrainian story. And there is no sign of that either. So you have to be a pretty cockeyed optimist to come up with an optimistic story, a hopeful story. And yet I do in that book. So see what you think of it.
The book is called Perfect Storm, Russia's Failed Economic Opening, the Hurricane of War and Sanctions, and the Uncertain Future Ahead. It is by Thane Gustafson, who we're talking to today. You can order it, listeners, and I urge you to, via our own virtual bookstore. Thane, if people want to find you online, I'm not suggesting you TikTok, but is there somewhere they can find you and continue the conversation or say nice things to you?
Well, the best way to reach me is via Georgetown University. So if you go to the Georgetown website and you hit faculty, you will find me there with all the courses that I teach and the books that I've written. This, I think, is book number 10. And the fun of that is to have had these incredible adventures. So this is first-person experience that goes into these books. So I welcome.
And long may these adventures continue. And otherwise, just do what I did. Put Thane Gustafson into Google or a search engine, and there's a wealth of stuff there. The book is called Perfect Storm, Russia's Failed Economic Opening, the Hurricane of War, Sanctions, and the Uncertain Future. It's by Thane Gustafson. Thane, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you today.
It's been wonderful, Giles, and to think of you in Marbella, that's marvelous.
Have a great day.
Thanks for the invitation.